awesome folks, I hope you're all well. Welcome to the second lecture for week 2 of HSP216. And this is where we're going to talk about the histories of police governance of Aboriginal people in particular. Now this is a very significant topic for Australian history because the treatment that Aboriginal people were subjected to by police in history very much shapes the ways that they think about and interact with police in the current day. And this is something that has impacted a range of different nations around the world that have been subject to colonisation, particularly of their First Nations people. So the stuff I'm going to talk to you about today is pretty challenging. There's a lot of information that a lot of people don't know about because they're not told about it at school and things like that. So please just take care of yourself. If you need to stop and give yourself a break so that you're feeling okay, then do so. The best thing about these lectures being YouTube videos online is that you can actually pause and take a break and go back to it if you need to. So yeah, as I said, this history created intense, problematic Indigenous police relationships that still exist today. And that is something that we are dealing with on a daily basis in Australia. And unfortunately, it has led to circumstances where Aboriginal people are so significantly overrepresented in our criminal processing systems in Australia that they are overrepresented at higher levels than Australian Anglo-Saxon folks at rates of sometimes like 25 times more likely to be incarcerated and so forth. So for instance, in the Northern Territory at the moment, 100% of young people that are incarcerated there are Aboriginal, and this is even though they only make up about 2.6% of the population there. So it's a very serious overrepresentation and a very serious issue that we need to address. The police role in colonisation and Aboriginal dispossession from their land involved a whole bunch of different stuff. It was very much a war between the colonisers and Aboriginal people during the late 1700s and early 1800s. And this has been called a war of extermination. It included what called dispersal. And dispersal was very much a euphemism for armed conflict. So disperse meant firing at, and police were involved in firing at 20,000 Aboriginal people that were killed. So you can understand why Aboriginal people have very significant concerns when police officers come to their door in the contemporary moment, knowing that they had such a significant role in the past with killing and murdering Aboriginal people. Police did have a pivotal role in land dispossession, and that meant firing at them. It meant dragging them off their land that they rightfully owned, and it was never ceded land. There was also a lot of Indigenous resistance to these processes, and this was in fact pivotal to centralisation in particular. Settlers sought protection from the 1830s from a colonial government that was under pressure to protect Aboriginal people. Most importantly, there was a lot of Aboriginal resistance to these processes. Aboriginal people didn't just allow the police to come in and do whatever they wanted. They resisted very much the process of being taken from their land and having their children taken away and so forth. So this was one of the things that led to the centralisation of police services in colonial historical Australia, because the settlers particularly sought protection from the government, and the government were also, ironically, under pressure to protect the Indigenous people because they were being killed at such alarming rates by the settlers and by police officers in those processes. Aboriginal people also had a role in policing. It wasn't just the police that came from the Irish convicts in Australia. They were subordinated quite substantially through processes of colonisation, but Indigenous people also became the agents of their own dispossession in this process. And they often did this in ways that were through processes of coercion. Aboriginal people didn't just rock up and say, hey, I want to be a police officer. It was more about white police officers going in and saying, we need you to do this. If you don't do this, we'll do this. You need to be part of it. They did get benefits out of those processes, such as being paid for it and so forth, but it was very typically a process that happened through different forms of coercion. Native police forces were a central part of policing processes in Australia, and they very much secured land for European settlement. So native troopers came under the command of white officers, and they were paramilitary units that were used to combat Aboriginal resistance. So Aboriginal people were talked about as forms of savagery, and resistance to colonisation was and settlement was what the native troopers were focused on. They were very much repressive. They drove Aboriginal people away from pastoral and mining areas and from creeks and waterways and waterholes where cows could drink from the water, and of course the Aboriginals were totally reliant on those waterholes. Cows would make them all turgid and stirred up, so the native police would take Aboriginal people away and keep them away from the cows, whereas the Aboriginal people often killed the cows to keep them away from the waterholes because they were destroying the waterholes. It was really problematic times. The native police were provided with the powers and authority to quieten the resistance, and this meant killing Aboriginal people. They were heavily involved in a lot of different massacres of Indigenous people, and they were quite well known for their significant violence. So interestingly enough, these early police forces were quite strategic. The violence of the Queensland Native Mounted Police, for instance, was well known because the police force was recruited from a neighbouring tribe that in Queensland that was warring with the specific Queensland Indigenous people. And so they were known as a killing machine, this Native Mounted Police, and they were specifically recruited from an area that they knew were warring with another area, so that they knew that police Aboriginal group would not use any discretion and would use full force of coercion and killing in order to quieten Indigenous resistance. Ironically, very shortly after these processes, police were the agents of administering Indigenous protection legislation. This was later in the 19th century when this legislation was enacted. The police were the ones that administered this. It was more moving away from the conflict-based policing to intensive surveillance and regulation. The legislation very much criminalised Aboriginal people based on their race, and they basically said, you're not good enough to be parents, so we're going to be parents for your children. And of course this legacy continues today in the form of child protection. The police functions under this new protection legislation in the 1900s were very much about police control over rations, police maintaining order on reserves, police controlling the access of Aboriginal people to and from the reserves, and expelling troublemakers by various means, but typically that meant arresting them and physically removing them. It also meant deciding whether or not an Aboriginal person was sick enough to see a doctor. So police were actually the ones that made that decision. It involved police recommending the disposal of reserve land and giving it away to the settlers and colonisers in those particular periods of time. It also meant removing children from their parents. And I've got a section of a movie called Rabbit Proof Fence where it talks about these processes. They were horrific, to say the least. And police also involved in instituting proceedings to remove whole Aboriginal communities from certain localities and moving them into reserves where they could be better protected. So police had lots of discretion with Aboriginal people, and this did involve police forces that were Aboriginal themselves. The legislative frameworks denied any human rights to Aboriginal people, and this became part of policing work. Discretion was afforded to superintendents and protectors, and this meant that there was very little restraint on the exercise of police powers overall. And some police, interestingly enough, thankfully enough I suppose, did actually support Aboriginal people, and they resisted what other police officers were doing in those communities. So they opposed abusive reserve managers, they argued against the resumption of land, and they opposed the stealing and removal of children from Aboriginal families. And there were a lot of native police that in fact deserted because they did not want to be a part of these policing processes. And they were quite often, unfortunately, hunted down and shot as a result of their desertion. So the governance of colonial police was very problematic. They lacked training, there was a poor quality of recruits due to the lower levels of pay, and this mandated better education, although this hasn't necessarily been implemented in the contemporary moment. We still don't have a lot of police officers, for instance, that go through tertiary programs. Training was basic, it was about writing, maths and good character, and I would argue that that pretty much stands to this day. They moved later to military drills and other forms of police training like that to try and implement discipline and order upon recruits and prepare them for crowd control. And again, this still stands very much today. But they were drawn from largely police and military backgrounds in Ireland. They were heavily surveilled in military ways, and they were overwhelmingly white male Anglo-Celtic all the way through till the 1970s and 1980s, when we had police royal commissions that pushed training diversification, but overwhelmingly we still had an apparent lack of police cultural awareness that was heavily criticised in royal commissions into Aboriginal police deaths in custody. So all of these things meant that police work in history was very problematic, very difficult to manage, and very much something that impacted on the lives of Aboriginal people in serious ways. So we've covered quite a lot of historical ground, but not heaps in detail. Like I've scanned across so many historical sources talking about this stuff. I hope that you do understand how Australian history is quite ironic in our policing, where our police forces were taken from people that were resistant to police forces in other countries. Who would have thought? And I hope you understand the importance of knowing about how we policed Aboriginal people in Australia, for how that's shaped the relationship with policing in contemporary Australia. Anyway, folks, I'm going to leave it there. I hope this was helpful, and I hope you have a really lovely week. Take care of each other, and I'll talk to you all soon. See you later.